At 180 miles per hour, 800 feet above German-occupied France, Lieutenant Thomas Harrison was dying. Not from bullets, not from flak, from physics itself. His fingers numb and frozen and barely functional, gripped a landing light housing the size of a coffee cup. Below him stretched 800 feet of empty air. Behind him waited a horizontal stabilizer that would kill him instantly if he slid backward even 6 inches. Inside the cockpit, 2 feet from his face, sat his best friend, Captain James Sullivan, flying an aircraft that every engineer at North American Aviation said should not be airborne. The Packard engine screamed at war emergency power. Metal vibrated against metal. Wind tore at Harrison's leather flight jacket with the force of a hurricane. His eyes stayed squeezed shut because opening them at this speed would be like staring into a sandstorm. The cold burned his exposed skin, 30 degrees below zero with wind chill. His hands had stopped hurting 5 minutes ago. Now they felt like blocks of wood attached to his wrists. 17 minutes earlier, they had been safe. 2 American fighter pilots in perfect formation escorting bombers home from Germany, thinking about hot coffee and powdered eggs, and maybe, just maybe, surviving another day of this war. Now they were defying every law of physics, every regulation in the United States Army Air Force's manual, and every odd calculated by the best aviation engineers in America. The probability of survival according to calculations that would be made later stood at less than 3%. But neither man knew those numbers yet. And even if they had, it would not have mattered, because this was not about mathematics. This was about debt. This was about loyalty. This was about 2 words that meant everything to American pilots in World War II. Never alone. April 1st, 1945. 60 miles southeast of Paris. The war in Europe had maybe 5 weeks left, though nobody knew that yet. What they knew was this: Germany was dying, but dying things fight hardest. And on this spring afternoon, with broken clouds casting shadows on French farmland, below physics and friendship and the weight of guilt, were about to collide in a way that would be studied, debated, and remembered for the next 80 years. How did 2 American pilots end up in this impossible situation? The answer begins 17 minutes earlier. 17 minutes when everything was fine. When the sky was clear and the mission was routine and death seemed like something that happened to other people. 17 minutes that felt like safety, but were actually the last few heartbeats before everything changed. Sullivan and Harrison flew in loose formation at 8,000 feet. Their P-51D Mustangs, those beautiful machines of aluminum and steel and American engineering, cut through the air with practiced ease. The mission had been a success. Bombers protected, oil refinery destroyed, enemy fighters scattered. Now came the easy part, the flight home. Harrison's voice crackled through the radio, young and confident and impossibly alive. "Hey, Sully, think we'll get fresh eggs for dinner tonight instead of that powdered garbage?" Sullivan's response came dry and measured, the voice of a man who never let himself hope for small mercies. "Dream on, farm boy." That was their routine. Harrison optimistic, Sullivan cautious. Balance. That was how Wingman worked. One man's hope tempered by another man's realism. One man's recklessness checked by another man's calculation. They had flown 42 missions together. They knew each other's voices better than they knew their own. Then came the sound, a sound that every pilot dreaded, a sound like a hammer hitting an oil drum. The heavy metallic boom of an 88mm shell finding its target. Harrison's voice suddenly stripped of its confidence. "Flak, I'm hit, I'm hit." Sullivan's head snapped left. 300 yards away, Harrison's Mustang trailed smoke. Not engine smoke, which was gray and came from burning oil. This was different. This was coolant smoke, white and black and streaming from the nose, like blood from an artery. German flak battery 447, positioned near the French town of Toul, had scored a direct hit on Harrison's coolant reservoir. One shell, one vulnerable point, 90 seconds before catastrophic failure. The Packard 5 1650 engine, that masterpiece of American manufacturing, required constant coolant circulation to function. Without it, metal temperatures would exceed 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. The pistons would seize. The prop would stop. The aircraft would become what pilots called a glider. Except gliders were designed to descend gracefully, and a P-51 Mustang with a dead engine descended like a stone thrown from a bridge. Sullivan watched Harrison's propeller, watched it slow, Watch the blades fighting against friction and heat and physics. Watch them freeze mid-rotation into three dark lines against the sky. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound a pilot could hear. Harrison's Mustang was falling at 120 miles per hour. Below them stretched 20 square miles of German-occupied territory. The 19th German Army, battered, but still dangerous, still desperate, occupied every village and farm. Machine gun nests dotted the tree lines. SS units patrolled the roads. For a downed American pilot, the survival rate was 12%. Most were shot on sight. Others disappeared into camps and were never seen again. The formation leader's voice cut through the radio, crisp and professional, and absolutely certain about what happened next. Mustang 5 is going down. Mustang 4 mark position and return to formation. Standard procedure, sensible procedure, the procedure that kept pilots alive in wars won. You marked where your wingman went down. You radioed the coordinates. You returned to base. You let the rescue teams do their job if rescue was even possible. You did not, under any circumstances, land your own aircraft in enemy territory. Fighter planes did not land behind enemy lines. They lacked the fuel to take off again. They lacked the space to maneuver. They lacked any logical reason to try. The mathematics were simple. One downed pilot was a tragedy. Two downed pilots was stupidity. But Sullivan was not thinking about mathematics. He was thinking about a night 6 months earlier. A night in August 1944 when he had made a mistake. A small mistake. A split-second decision that had seemed right at the time but had ended with his previous wingman, Lieutenant Patrick O'Brien, dying in a ball of fire over Belgium. O'Brien had been 22 years old. Red hair, Boston accent, engaged to a girl named Catherine who worked in a munitions plant. O'Brien, who laughed too loud and sang off key and believed with absolute certainty that he would survive the war and marry Catherine and raise 4 children and grow old watching Red Sox games in Fenway Park. O'Brien, who was dead because Sullivan had broken radio discipline to warn him about enemy fighters. O'Brien, who had reacted to that warning by banking right straight into an ambush. 5 Focke-Wulf 190s had converged on his position. 14 seconds. That was how long it took for a P-51 to explode when 5 German fighters tore it apart. Sullivan had counted every second. The inquiry had cleared him. Pilot error, they said. O'Brien's mistake. But Sullivan knew the truth. He had created the situation. He had forced O'Brien into a split-second decision. He had killed his wingman as surely as if he had pulled the trigger himself. For 6 months, Sullivan had carried that weight. For 183 days, he had woken up screaming. For 26 weeks, he had looked at other pilots and wondered if he would kill them too. Then 2 months ago, Harrison had saved Sullivan's life. During a dogfight over Germany, Sullivan had run out of ammunition and found himself with 3 F-109s on his tail. Harrison had broken formation, violated procedure, burned 40% of his fuel in a vertical dive to kill those fighters before they could kill Sullivan. Harrison had barely made it back to base. His engine had died on the runway from fuel starvation. On the tarmac, Sullivan had walked to Harrison's aircraft, had looked at this 21-year-old farm boy from Texas who had just risked everything to save him, had said the only words that mattered. "I owe you my life." Harrison had grinned, exhausted and exhilarated, and utterly unaware of the weight he had just lifted from Sullivan's shoulders. "Buy me a beer, we're even." But they were not even. They would never be even, because Harrison had given Sullivan something more valuable than life. He had given him a chance at redemption. And debts like that, Sullivan understood, were paid in action, not words. Now Harrison was falling toward 30 German soldiers who were already running toward the only clearing large enough for a landing, falling toward capture or death or disappearance into the machinery of a dying regime that killed prisoners as casually as it killed its own people. Falling toward the same fate that O'Brien had met, except this time Sullivan had a choice. He could follow procedure. He could mark the position. He could return to base. He could let Harrison become another statistic, another name on a casualty list, another letter sent to a family in Texas explaining that their son had died serving his country. Or he could do something that every regulation forbade, something that every calculation said was impossible, something that if he succeeded would be studied by aviation engineers for decades as an example of how far a pilot could push the limits of physics and machine and human endurance. Sullivan's hand moved to the throttle, pushed it forward, nosed the Mustang into a steep dive, made the decision before his conscious mind could articulate all the reasons why this was suicide. The formation leader's voice came sharp with authority. Mustang 4 acknowledged, return to formation. Sullivan reached down and cut his radio. The gesture felt final, like cutting a rope on a sinking ship. He was committed now. Whatever happened next, he was on his own. As he dove toward the occupied French countryside, Sullivan's training kicked in. His mind began running calculations automatically the way it always did when things got dangerous. Weight and balance, fuel and distance, probability and consequence. Current aircraft weight, 7,125 pounds, empty, plus pilot, plus ammunition, plus fuel. Fuel gauge showed 140 gallons remaining. That was 840 pounds. At his own weight, 180 pounds. Add ammunition, 400 pounds. Total 8,545 pounds. Now add Harrison, 165 pounds, a farm boy from Texas who wrote letters to a girl named Mary Ann and dreamed about owning a hardware store and never ever expected to end up clinging to the wing of a fighter plane at 180 miles per hour. Total takeoff weight, 8,710 pounds. The P-51D was rated for a maximum takeoff weight of 12,100 pounds. So the weight was manageable. The math said it should work. But the math was lying, because the math assumed Harrison would be inside the aircraft properly secured, his weight distributed through the center of gravity. The math assumed a normal takeoff run of 1,100 yards on a proper runway. The math assumed no battle damage, no hostile fire, no 30 German soldiers with rifles and machine guns converging on your position. The clearing below was 800 yards long, 300 yards short of what the manual said was required. And Harrison would be on the wing creating massive drag, pulling the aircraft to the left, disrupting every aerodynamic principle that made flight possible. The real probability of success was not in any manual, but Sullivan calculated it anyway, 3%. Maybe 5 if the wind was favorable and the trees were not too tall, and God decided to pay attention to the prayers of a Catholic boy from Philadelphia who had not been to Mass in 8 months. 3%. Long enough to fail. Just barely short enough that attempting it was not complete insanity. Sullivan dove through the clouds at 380 miles per hour. His Mustang shook from the speed. The controls grew heavy. The wings flexed. Everything screamed at him to pull up, slow down, think about what he was doing. But thinking was what had killed O'Brien. Hesitation was what had let 5 German fighters close the distance. Procedure was what had put Patrick O'Brien's name on a casualty list instead of putting him on a ship home to Catherine. Sullivan was done thinking. Sullivan was done following procedure. Sullivan was going to get his wingman, bring him home, or die trying. And if the mathematics said it was impossible, then Sullivan would do what Americans had been doing since Valley Forge and Gettysburg in the Argonne Forest. He would make the impossible happen anyway. Below him, Harrison's Mustang touched down hard in the French clearing. Dirt exploded from the wheels. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then rolled to a stop 600 yards from the tree line. German soldiers emerged from the forest, weapons ready, running. Sullivan counted them through his gun sight. 30. 30 soldiers in Feldgrau uniforms carrying Mauser rifles and machine pistols, and the kind of desperate determination that came from knowing the war was lost, but fighting anyway because that was what soldiers did. Every tactical manual in existence said Sullivan should climb to altitude radio for rescue and return to base. Every ounce of common sense said landing in this clearing was suicide. Every voice in his head that sounded like his training, officers and his mother and basic human self-preservation said, do not do this. But there was another voice, quieter, deeper. The voice that sounded like a promise made on a cold English night when Harrison had looked at him and said, if something happens to me up there, don't do anything stupid. Sullivan was about to do something very stupid. He pulled back on the throttle, extended his landing gear, dropped his flaps, lined up his approach on the clearing, crossed the tree line at 20 feet, geared down, airspeed 90 miles per hour. The ground rushed up to meet him. Trees on both sides. No margin for error. No room for second thoughts. He flared. The main gear slammed into French soil with enough force to rattle his teeth. The impact jarred through the airframe. Metal groaned. Bolts stressed. The Mustang bounced, settled, rolled. Sullivan kept the power up, kept moving because stopping meant dying. Bullets struck dirt near his landing gear. The Germans had found their range. More soldiers poured from the tree line. An MG-42 machine gun opened fire from the edge of the forest, that distinctive sound like canvas tearing 1,200 rounds per minute, converging on his aircraft. Tracer rounds arced over his canopy. One bullet punched through his cockpit floor and exited through the canopy 6 inches from his face, spiderwebbing the bulletproof glass. Sullivan did not flinch, did not react, just kept his eyes locked on Harrison's aircraft 400 yards ahead. His Mustang raced across the clearing at 40 miles per hour. 50. Bullets hit his airframe with metallic pings. Each hit meant damage. Each damage meant decreased probability of success. 3% became 2%, became 1%. Sullivan did not care about the math anymore. He cared about the man climbing out of that disabled Mustang 300 yards ahead. He cared about a promise. He cared about debt and duty, and the knowledge that if he flew away now, he would spend the rest of his life wondering if he could have made a difference. He slammed on the brakes beside Harrison's aircraft, kept his engine running because stopping meant never starting again, shouted over the roar of the Packard engine, "Get on the wing, route lay flat." Harrison grabbed his canvas bag containing maps and code books, ran the 20 feet between the two aircraft while bullets kicked up dirt fountains around his boots. Reached Sullivan's Mustang, threw his bag into the cockpit, climbed onto the left wing with the practiced urgency of a man who understood that every second counted. He spread himself flat against the wing root, the thickest part where the wing met the fuselage, gripped the landing light housing with both hands, braced his feet against the 50 caliber gun ports, pressed his face against cold aluminum, made himself as small and aerodynamic as possible. Sullivan looked at him through the canopy. Their eyes met, no words needed, no grand speeches, just a nod. Sullivan. "Hold on, Harrison, don't crash." Then Sullivan shoved the throttle to maximum power. The Packard engine transitioned from a roar to a scream. 1,800 horsepower at war emergency power, a setting rated for 5 minutes maximum before engine failure. The Mustang lurched forward. Wind hit Harrison like a physical blow. The prop wash alone was enough to tear a man loose, but Harrison held on fingers. Locked body flattened, every muscle tensed against forces that wanted to rip him from the wing and dash him against the ground. They accelerated across the clearing. 40 miles per hour, 50, 60. The Germans closed to 200 yards. Machine gun fire intensified. Bullets hit the tail section with the sound of hail on a tin roof. One round missed Sullivan's leg by 4 inches. 70 miles per hour. Sullivan kept the stick neutral, letting the aircraft find its own balance. The tail came up naturally. Harrison felt the aircraft posture change, felt the horizontal wind become vertical, felt every instinct scream at him to let go, because this could not possibly work. 80 miles per hour. The aircraft pulled hard to the left from Harrison's weight. Sullivan crushed the right rudder pedal, compensating, fighting for control. His right leg cramped. He ignored it. 90 miles per hour. Normal rotation speed. Sullivan pulled back on the stick. The nose lifted slightly. The main gear stayed on the ground. Not enough speed, too much weight, too much drag. 200 yards to the trees, 100 miles per hour, 110. The Germans were 100 yards away. Sullivan could see individual faces, could see a soldier raising his Mauser, could see the muzzle flash. 115 miles per hour. Sullivan pulled back harder. The Mustang wanted to fly but could not generate enough lift. The wing loading was wrong. The center of gravity was wrong. Everything was wrong. 118 miles per hour. Something changed. The main gear lifted. Daylight appeared beneath the tires. They were flying, barely, mushing through the air, trying to stall, hanging by the thinnest margin between controlled flight and catastrophic failure. 75 yards to the trees. Sullivan held the stick exactly where it was. Too much back pressure, and they would stall and crash. Too little, and they would settle back and hit the trees. 50 yards. Harrison opened his eyes, saw branches, saw a bird's nest in the upper limbs. That was how low they were. 25 yards. Sullivan's hands were locked on the controls. His entire world had narrowed to stick pressure and engine sound, and the wall of green filling his windscreen. They cleared the trees with 6 feet of vertical separation. Branches scraped the belly with a sickening crunch of metal on wood. The aircraft shuddered. Sullivan fought the controls. They were through, but they were flying at 120 miles per hour with the landing gear still down. Stall speed in this configuration was 115. Margin 5 miles per hour. Death was one small gust away. Sullivan reached for the gear handle. His hand shook. Not from fear, from the adrenaline finally catching up. He pulled. The hydraulic motors whined. The main gear pivoted into the wheel wells. The Mustang's surged forward drag suddenly reduced. Airspeed increased to 125 miles per hour. They were climbing at 200 feet per minute. In normal conditions, the P-51 should climb at 2,000 feet per minute. But these were not normal conditions. These were conditions that existed in the narrow space between impossible and not quite impossible. Sullivan leveled off at 500 feet, reduced power from war emergency to maximum continuous. The engine temperature dropped from red to yellow. He banked gently left, heading west toward Allied lines 60 miles away. On the wing, Harrison clung to the landing light housing. The wind at 180 miles per hour felt like being pressed by an invisible hand. The cold burned his exposed skin. His fingers were already numb. He could not breathe properly, could not think properly, could only hold on and trust that the man in the cockpit 2 feet away knew what he was doing. 17 minutes. That was how long it would take to reach Allied lines. 17 minutes of Harrison clinging to metal at speeds that should not allow a human body to remain attached. 17 minutes of Sullivan flying with perfect precision, every control input measured, because one mistake would kill them both. Neither man knew the calculations that would be made later. Neither man knew that aviation engineers would declare this feat statistically impossible. Neither man knew that German soldiers on the ground had stopped firing and were standing in astonishment watching something they had never seen and would never forget. All they knew was this: they were alive. They were flying, and they had defied every rule, every regulation, and every calculation that said this could not be done. Because that was what wingmen did. That was what Americans did. That was what free men did for each other when duty and friendship and the weight of debt collided in the skies above a war that had already taken too many good men. April 1st, 1945, 60 miles southeast of Paris. 2 pilots in 1 aircraft. 17 minutes from safety. And a story that would be remembered long after the last veteran of that terrible war had gone to his rest. This was how it began. Harrison had stopped feeling his hands at minute 3. The numbness crept from his fingertips up through his palms and into his wrists. At 180 miles per hour, the wind chill dropped the air temperature to 30 degrees below zero. His leather flight gloves, designed for a heated cockpit, offered no protection against this kind of sustained exposure. The landing light housing he gripped was no bigger around than a soup can. Every muscle in his forearms burned from the constant tension of holding on. His shoulders screamed. His back felt like someone was driving hot nails into his spine. But he could not let go, would not let go, because 800 feet below, the French countryside rolled past at 3 miles per minute. If his grip failed, if his frozen fingers released, he would slide backward into the horizontal stabilizer and be cut in half by the metal edge. Or he would fall, tumbling through empty air for 5 eternal seconds before hitting the ground hard enough to turn his body into something unrecognizable. So Harrison held on. He kept his eyes closed because opening them at this speed would be like trying to see underwater. The wind tore at his face. His lips had gone numb. His ears roared with engine noise and rushing air. He could not hear his own thoughts, could not form coherent sentences in his mind. His entire existence had narrowed to a single imperative grip hold: survive. Inside the cockpit, 2 feet away, Sullivan flew with absolute precision. Every control input measured, every adjustment calculated. Because Sullivan understood what Harrison could not see, they were flying an aircraft that should not be airborne. The asymmetric weight distribution from Harrison's body on the left wing required constant right rudder pressure. Sullivan's right leg cramped from holding the pedal. He ignored the pain, ignored the fatigue, ignored everything except keeping the aircraft stable. One wrong move would kill them both. A gust of wind from the wrong direction. A momentary loss of concentration. A control input half a second too late. The margin between life and death was measured in inches and milliseconds. Sullivan checked his instruments. Airspeed 180, altitude 800 feet, fuel 120 gallons remaining, Engine temperature yellow zone acceptable. Oil pressure normal. The Mustang was holding together despite the bullet holes, despite the stress, despite everything that said this should not work. He glanced over his left shoulder trying to see Harrison. Could barely make out the dark shape pressed against the wing. No way to know if Harrison was conscious. No way to communicate. No way to help if something went wrong. Sullivan could only fly and hope and pray to a God he was not sure still listened to the prayers of men who killed for a living. At minute 7, Harrison began to hallucinate. The cold and the hypoxia and the sheer terror combined to produce visions. He saw Marianne's face, her smile, the way her hair caught the Texas sunlight. He heard his father's voice calling him home for dinner. He felt the warm wood of the hardware store counter under his hands. For a moment, he was not on a wing at 800 feet. He was home. He was safe. He was anywhere but here. Then turbulence hit. The Mustang bounced in rough air. Harrison's body lifted slightly from the wing. For one terrible instant, his grip loosened. His fingers started to slide. 800 feet of empty air waited below. Terror brought him back. His fingers locked down again, gripping harder muscles, screaming. He was not home. He was not safe. He was clinging to a piece of metal, flying through hostile airspace, and every second might be his last. Sullivan felt the turbulence and corrected immediately. Smooth control inputs, gentle adjustments. He knew Harrison was back there. Knew that every bump, every jolt, every moment of instability brought his wingman closer to falling. The responsibility crushed down on him like a physical weight. This was worse than combat. In combat, you could shoot back. In combat, the enemy was visible. This was different. This was flying blind, hoping your skill was enough, knowing it might not be. At minute 10, Harrison almost let go deliberately. The cold had spread through his entire body. His core temperature was dropping. Hypothermia does strange things to the mind. It whispers lies. It makes surrender seem reasonable. It suggests that letting go would bring warmth and rest and an end to suffering. Harrison's fingers began to relax, just a little, just enough. Then the Mustang banked gently to the left. Centrifugal force pressed Harrison harder against the wing. The pressure reminded him Sullivan was still flying, still fighting to keep him alive, still refusing to give up. If Sullivan was not giving up, Harrison could not give up either. That was what wingmen meant. That was the code. You held on because the other man was holding on for you. Harrison's fingers tightened again. His jaw clenched. Through frozen lips, he whispered words that the wind tore away instantly. Not today. Not like this. Sullivan had no idea how close Harrison had come to falling. Had no idea that at minute 10 death had whispered in his wingman's ear and been refused. Sullivan just kept flying, kept checking his instruments, kept scanning for Allied positions, kept doing the only thing he could do, get them home. At minute 12, Sullivan saw friendly territory. Sherman tanks, those distinctive American silhouettes, moved along a road below. Troops in olive drab uniforms. The crisp geometric lines of Allied defensive positions. They had crossed the lines. They were safe. Or as safe as two men could be when one was clinging to the outside of an aircraft at 180 miles per hour. Sullivan reached down and toggled his radio back on. Static, then a voice. Unidentified P-51, this is Falcon Base. Identify yourself. Sullivan's voice came out rough, strained from tension and suppressed fear. Falcon Base, this is Captain James Sullivan, 357 Fighter Group, requesting emergency landing. I have unusual circumstances. A pause, then with understandable confusion. Sullivan stated your emergency. I have a passenger on my wing. Repeat, passenger on wing. Need ambulance standing by. The pause lasted longer this time. Sullivan could almost hear the radio operator trying to process what he had just heard. Say again, passenger on your wing. You heard me correctly. Clear the runway. I am coming in. Sullivan could see the airfield now. A forward-base rough dirt strip maybe 1,200 yards long. Better than the clearing they had taken off from, but not by much. Ground crews were already gathering, pointing at his aircraft. Even from altitude, Sullivan could see their confusion. Then their astonishment as they realized what they were seeing. There was a man on that wing, a living man, at nearly 200 miles per hour. Sullivan set up his approach carefully. Everything smooth, everything gentle. No sudden movements, no sharp turns. Harrison had survived 17 minutes. Sullivan would not kill him now by being careless. Gear down, flaps extended, airspeed dropping to 120, 100, 85. The Mustang crossed the threshold of the runway at 80 miles per hour. Sullivan flared gentle as a kiss, the main gear touched with barely a bump. The smoothest landing of his career because anything less might dislodge Harrison. The aircraft rolled to a stop after 400 yards. Sullivan's hands shook as he reached up to cut the engine. The sudden silence felt wrong after 17 minutes of constant noise. His ears rang. His right leg cramped so badly he nearly cried out. But they were down. They were stopped. They were alive. Sullivan opened the canopy and tried to stand. His legs would not support him. Adrenaline crash hitting like a freight train. He gripped the canopy rail, forced himself up, stumbled out onto the wing. Ran to where Harrison lay. Harrison had not moved. His eyes were closed. His hands were still locked around the landing light housing. His face was blue-white from cold. Ice crystals had formed in his eyebrows. Tommy, Tommy, no response. Sullivan grabbed Harrison's shoulder, shook him. Nothing. Flooded through Sullivan's chest. They had made it. They had survived. Harrison could not be dead. Not after everything. Not after the impossible had been made possible. Then Harrison's eyes opened, slowly, painfully. He looked at Sullivan without recognition at first. Then awareness returned. His lips moved. No sound came out. He tried again. Did we make it? Sullivan's laugh came out half sob. We made it, farm boy. We made it. Harrison tried to smile. Failed. His face was too frozen. Then his eyes rolled back and consciousness left him. Medics arrived at a run. They tried to pry Harrison's hands off the landing light housing. His fingers would not release. The muscles had locked from sustained contraction and cold. One medic, an older man, who had seen cases of extreme hypothermia before, knew what to do. He carefully massaged Harrison's forearms, working the muscles, talking quietly. Easy, son, you are safe now. You can let go. You are safe. It took 3 minutes before Harrison's fingers finally relaxed enough to release. They lifted him onto a stretcher, wrapped him in wool blankets, carried him toward the medical tent at a run. Sullivan tried to follow, made it 5 steps before his legs gave out. He sat down hard on the wing of his aircraft, put his head in his hands, started shaking. Not from cold, from the weight of what they had just done crashing down on him all at once. A ground crew chief approached cautiously. Young kid, maybe 20, with wide eyes and a Louisiana accent. Sir Captain Sullivan, you okay? Sullivan looked up. The kid's face showed something between awe and disbelief. I just flew 70 miles with a man on my wing. Yes, sir, I saw. We all saw. That was the most incredible thing I have ever seen in my life. Sullivan laughed. It sounded bitter even to his own ears. Incredible, that is one word for it. Insane is another. Impossible is a third. But you did it, sir. Yeah, we did it. The crew chief hesitated, then asked the question everyone would ask for the next 80 years. Why did you do it? Sullivan stood slowly. His legs still felt shaky, but they held. He looked at his Mustang, saw the bullet holes, counted them. 11 in the right wing, 23 in the fuselage. More in the tail. Every hole was a small miracle. Every hole represented a round that could have hit something vital and did not. Because 2 months ago, he saved my life. Because 6 months ago, I lost a wingman, and I have been carrying that weight ever since. Because we made a promise. Because that is what Americans do. We do not leave people behind, even when it is impossible, especially when it is impossible. The crew chief nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe every man who had served understood that there were debts that could only be paid in action, that there were promises that transcended regulations and survival instinct and basic common sense. Sullivan walked toward the medical tent. Each step felt heavy. The adrenaline was wearing off completely now. Exhaustion hit like a physical blow. His hands started shaking again. His vision blurred. He realized he was crying and did not care enough to stop. Inside the tent, medics worked on Harrison. Blankets, heating pads, warm intravenous fluids. The doctor, a major with gray hair and kind eyes, looked up as Sullivan entered. Your friend is very lucky. Severe hypothermia, frostbite on his fingers and face. But he will live. Another 10 minutes in that cold, and we would be having a different conversation. Can I see him? 5 minutes. He needs rest. Sullivan approached the cot where Harrison lay. His friend's face had regained some color. His breathing was steady. His eyes were closed, but Sullivan could see the rapid movement beneath the lids, dreaming, or reliving, or processing what his mind could not quite accept had happened. Sullivan sat beside the cot, spoke quietly. Tommy, I know you cannot hear me, but I need to say this. You saved my life 2 months ago. Today I return the favor. We are even now. No more debts, no more guilt. Just brothers, just wingmen. That is enough. Harrison's eyes opened, focused on Sullivan. His voice came out rough, damaged from screaming into the wind. Sully, that was the stupidest thing anyone has ever done. I know. You could have died. I know. You should have left me. I know. Harrison's eyes filled with tears. He tried to speak, but could not. Finally managed 3 words. Thank you, Jimmy. Sullivan gripped his friend's shoulder, could not speak himself, just nodded. The doctor cleared his throat. Captain Sullivan, you should rest. You are in shock whether you realize it or not. In a minute. Sir, that was not a suggestion. Sullivan stood reluctantly, looked down at Harrison one more time. His wingman had already fallen into real sleep, the kind of sleep that came after survival, after the impossible, after defying death in physics in every sensible voice that said this could not be done. Outside, the crew chief had gathered a dozen men around Sullivan's Mustang. They were examining the aircraft with professional interest and growing disbelief. One of them, the crew chief engineer, looked up as Sullivan approached. Captain, do we need to inspect this bird before you fly her again? But I got to tell you, I have been working on Mustangs for 2 years. What you did today should not have been possible. I know. I mean it, sir. Look at this. The engineer pointed to the right wing. The bullet holes were clustered in a pattern that should have severed control cables, should have ruptured the fuel tank, should have caused structural failure during the high-G pullout from the dive. You see these holes 3 more inches to the left, and your aileron cable is cut. You lose aileron authority, you cannot control the roll, you crash. This one here, 6 inches higher, and it takes out your main fuel line. You lose fuel pressure, engine quits, you crash. This one in the tail that missed your elevator control rod by less than 2 inches. You lose elevator, you cannot control pitch, you crash. Sullivan stared at the holes. Each one a small miracle. Each one a reminder that survival sometimes came down to inches and luck and forces beyond human control. How many holes total? The engineer consulted his clipboard. 34 that we have found so far, plus damage to your left horizontal stabilizer that I do not even want to think about. Sir, this aircraft should not have flown. The fact that you landed it, took off again, and flew 70 miles with a passenger on the wing, that is not skill, that is not luck, that is something else entirely. Sullivan thought about O'Brien, thought about how small factors, small decisions, small moments of chance could mean the difference between living and dying. O'Brien's Mustang had taken fewer hits, and he had still died. Sullivan's Mustang had been shot to pieces, and both men had survived. There was no logic to it, no equation that could predict it, no training that could guarantee it. War was random and cruel, and sometimes it let good men live when every calculation said they should die. When can you have her flight ready? The engineer blinked. Sir, this bird is not flying anywhere. She needs major repairs, weeks in a depot, maybe a month. How long to make her safe enough to limp back to base? Captain, did you hear what I just said? I heard you. Answer the question. The engineer sighed, looked at his crew, back at Sullivan. 3 days, maybe 4, but she will not be combat ready. You will be flying a barely functional airplane held together with patch plates and hope. 3 days then. Get it done. Sullivan walked away before the engineer could protest further. His body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Every step took effort. The medical tent swam in his vision. He made it to an empty cot and collapsed. Did not remember closing his eyes. Did not remember falling asleep. Just remembered darkness and silence and the blessed absence of fear. When he woke 6 hours later, the sun was setting. Someone had covered him with a blanket. His boots were off. His flight jacket hung on a nearby chair. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then memory returned. The mission. The hit, the landing, the takeoff. Harrison on the wing, 17 minutes of flying the impossible. He sat up too quickly. The tent spun. A nurse appeared, middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense expression. Easy, Captain. You have been through an ordeal. Harrison, Lieutenant Harrison, where is he? Resting, he woke an hour ago, ate some soup. His hands will heal. His pride might take longer. He keeps saying he should have been braver. He was brave. He held on for 17 minutes. That is what I told him. He did not believe me. Sullivan stood. His legs held this time. The nurse tried to stop him. Sir, you need rest. I need to see my wingman. She recognized the tone. The kind that said arguing would be pointless. She stepped aside. Harrison was awake when Sullivan entered. His hands were bandaged. His face had regained normal color. He looked young and tired and somehow older than he had that morning. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Harrison spoke. I almost let go Sully. At minute 10, I was ready to just let go and fall. Sullivan pulled a chair close, sat down. But you did not. Because you were still flying, because you did not give up on me. I owed you. We are even now. Sullivan thought about O'Brien, thought about guilt and debt and the weight men carry. Even now, even after the impossible rescue part of him still saw Patrick O'Brien's Mustang exploding, still heard the radio silence that followed, still felt the crushing weight of responsibility. Are we really even? Harrison looked at him, really looked at him, saw past the calm exterior to the guilt still eating at Sullivan's core. O'Brien's death was not your fault, Jimmy. We have had this conversation, and we will keep having it until you believe me. You made a split-second call, O'Brien reacted. 5 German fighters killed him. Not you, them. You did not pull those triggers. I created the situation. You tried to save him. Just like you saved me today. That is what you do. You try to save people. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. But you cannot carry the failures and ignore the successes. That is not balance. That is just punishment. Sullivan had no answer. Harrison was right. Logically, rationally, Harrison was completely right. But guilt did not respond to logic. Guilt was its own beast, feeding on itself, growing in the dark corners of the mind. They sat in silence as the sun set outside, as the sounds of the bass settled into evening routine, as 2 men who had defied death tried to process what they had survived. Finally, Harrison spoke again. Thank you, Sully, for coming back, for landing, for 17 minutes of the most terrifying experience of my life. Thank you. You would have done the same. Maybe. I do not know if I am that brave or that crazy. Sullivan smiled, a real smile. The first in months. Little bit of both, farm boy. Little bit of both. 3 days after the rescue, Sullivan stood in a makeshift office at the Forward Air Base and listened to Colonel Hayes explain why he should be court-martialed. The colonel was a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, 42 years old with gray in his hair and eyes that had seen too many young men die. He sat behind a field desk covered with maps and intelligence reports and a single sheet of paper containing Sullivan's after-action report. Outside, the sounds of the air base continued, engines being tested, voices shouting, the ordinary machinery of war grinding forward. Hayes picked up Sullivan's report, read it again even though he had already memorized every word. Captain Sullivan, you violated direct orders from your formation leader. You abandoned your assigned position. You landed in enemy territory without authorization. You endangered your aircraft. You conducted an unauthorized rescue operation. You exceeded your aircraft's operational limitations. You put both yourself and Lieutenant Harrison at unacceptable risk. Sullivan stood at attention, said nothing. What could he say? Every accusation was true. Hayes set the report down, leaned back in his chair. The silence stretched for 30 seconds. A minute. Sullivan kept his eyes fixed on a point above the colonel's head, waited for the judgment. And you saved your wingman's life by performing a feat of airmanship that our aviation engineers tell me should not have been possible. Hayes stood, walked to the window, looked out at the airfield where Sullivan's bullet-riddled Mustang sat under repair. I have been flying since 1936. I have commanded fighter squadrons for 2 years. I have written more casualty letters than I care to remember, and I have never in my entire career witnessed or even heard of anything remotely similar to what you did." He turned back to Sullivan. "Do you understand what you accomplished? Not just surviving, though that alone is remarkable. You landed under fire. You took off in 300 yards less than the manual says is required. You flew 70 miles with a man on your wing. Every calculation says you should have failed. Every probability says you should have died, yet here you stand." "Yes, sir." "Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air. Sullivan had been asked this a dozen times already. By the medics, by other pilots, by the crew chiefs working on his aircraft. Each time he gave a different answer because the truth was complicated and shifted depending on who was asking. But Hayes deserved the truth, the real truth. "6 months ago, I made a mistake that got my wingman killed. 2 months ago, Lieutenant Harrison saved my life by violating the same regulations I violated 3 days ago. I owed him a debt. I paid it. That is all." Hayes studied Sullivan's face, saw something there that made him nod slowly. "I am recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and I am grounding you for 3 days while we complete the investigation and repair your aircraft." "Dismissed." Sullivan saluted, started to leave. Hayes stopped him with a word. "Captain?" "Sir, O'Brien's death was not your fault. The inquiry cleared you. But you do not believe that, do you?" Sullivan's jaw tightened. He said nothing. "I thought not. Listen to me. In war, we make split-second decisions with incomplete information. Sometimes those decisions work. Sometimes they do not. You tried to save O'Brien. You succeeded in saving Harrison. You cannot carry one and ignore the other. That is not honor. That is self-destruction." "Yes, sir." Hayes waved him away. Sullivan left, walked across the airfield to where Harrison sat outside the medical tent. His hands were still bandaged but healing. The frostbite had been mild. Another few weeks and he would regain full function. Harrison looked up as Sullivan approached. "So are they shooting you or pinning a medal on you?" "Medal, Distinguished Flying Cross." "That is good. You deserve it." "Do I?" Harrison heard the doubt, the guilt still eating at Sullivan despite everything. He had hoped the rescue would give Sullivan peace, would let him finally forgive himself for O'Brien, but some wounds went too deep for one act of heroism to heal. "Yeah, Sully, you do." Sullivan sat beside him. They watched mechanics working on aircraft, watched pilots walking to the flight line for afternoon missions, watched the ordinary rhythm of war continue as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "I can still see him, Tommy, every night. O'Brien's plane exploding. Every night for 6 months. And now after saving me, now I see 2 things. O'Brien dying, and you on that wing 1 gust away from falling. I traded 1 nightmare for 2. Harrison had no answer for that. How do you tell a man to stop carrying guilt when the guilt had become part of who he was, when letting it go would mean forgetting? And forgetting would mean the dead did not matter. They sat in silence as the sun moved across the sky, as the war continued around them, as 2 men tried to find their way back from impossible things. The next weeks passed in a blur. Sullivan and Harrison returned to their squadron at Debden, flew missions, escorted bombers, did their jobs. But something had changed. Other pilots looked at them differently now, with awe, with questions, with the weight of witnessing something that would become legend. The story spread. The pilot who landed in enemy territory, the wingman who survived on the wing, the impossible rescue. Details got exaggerated with each retelling. 30 German soldiers became 50. 6 feet of clearance over the trees became 6 inches. The truth was extraordinary enough. But stories have gravity. They pull embellishment toward them. Sullivan hated the attention, refused interviews, gave terse answers when asked. Harrison followed his lead. They did not want to be heroes. They wanted to be forgotten. Wanted to return to the anonymity of doing their jobs and surviving one more day. But on May 7, 1945, everything changed again. Germany surrendered. The news came over the radio at 1400 hours. Unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Men cheered, threw their caps in the air, broke out contraband whiskey, laughed and cried and tried to process the fact that they had survived. Sullivan sat alone in the barracks, wrote a letter he had been writing for 6 months, a letter to Mrs. O'Brien in Boston. A letter explaining that her son had died because Sullivan had made a mistake. A letter asking for forgiveness he knew he did not deserve. He wrote 3 pages, detailed and honest and raw. Then he tore it up. What was the point? O'Brien was dead. A letter would not bring him back. Guilt would not resurrect him. Some debts could never be repaid because the person you owed was gone and all you could do was carry the weight. Harrison found him there an hour later, sitting among torn pieces of paper, staring at nothing. Everyone is celebrating. War is over, Sully. I know. Then why are you sitting here alone? Because O'Brien is not here to celebrate. Because he should be going home to Catherine. Because I took that from him. Harrison sat down, picked up a piece of torn letter, read the fragment. You were going to send this to his mother. I thought about it. What would it accomplish except to cause her more pain, to make her question what she has been told? She deserves the truth. The truth is her son died in combat, fighting for his country. That is what matters. Not your guilt, not your mistakes, his sacrifice. Let him have that. Let him be remembered as a hero instead of as your failure. The words hit harder than Harrison intended. Sullivan flinched as if struck, stood abruptly. You think I am making this about me? You think I am being selfish? I think you are punishing yourself for being human. I think you are carrying weight that is crushing you. I think saving my life was not enough to make you forgive yourself, and I do not know what will be. Maybe nothing will be. Maybe I do not deserve forgiveness. Everyone deserves forgiveness, Jimmy. Even you. They stared at each other. The friendship that had been forged in fire and tested by impossible things, now strained under the weight of words that needed to be said but hurt to hear. Sullivan walked out, left Harrison sitting among the torn pieces of a letter that would never be sent. Went to find the whiskey and the celebration and some way to forget, even for a few hours, that surviving meant remembering. The party lasted until dawn. Men drank and sang and told stories. Sullivan drank more than the others, tried to drown the guilt in alcohol and failed. Ended up outside at 300 hours vomiting in the grass, head spinning, wondering why surviving felt worse than dying. Harrison found him there, helped him back to the barracks, got him into his bunk, sat beside him until his breathing steadied into sleep. In the morning, Sullivan woke with a headache and shame. Found Harrison already awake, sitting on his own bunk, watching. I am sorry, Sullivan said, for what I had done. For last night. For being a mess. For not being able to let go. You are allowed to be a mess, Sully. You just flew through hell and back. Literally, you are allowed to be human. I do not feel human. I feel broken. Harrison moved to sit beside him, put a hand on his shoulder. Then we will put you back together. That is what brothers do. Brothers. The word hit Sullivan in the chest. He had lost a brother in O'Brien, had found another in Harrison. But the loss still outweighed the gain, still tilted the scales toward darkness. How, Sullivan asked quietly, how do I move past this? I do not know, but we figure it out together. That is the deal. That is what Wingman means. On the ground as much as in the air. Over the next 2 weeks, they prepared to go home. Processing, paperwork, medical checks, the machinery of demobilization grinding forward. Sullivan received his Distinguished Flying Cross in a brief ceremony on May 15th. Colonel Hayes pinned the medal on his chest and said words about courage and devotion to duty. Sullivan stood at attention and felt nothing. The medal was a piece of metal. O'Brien was still dead. Harrison was still haunted by 17 minutes on a wing. Nothing had changed except now there was documentation. On June 1st, they boarded a transport ship to New York. 2 weeks at sea with hundreds of other servicemen heading home. Most were jubilant, celebrating, planning futures. Sullivan spent hours at the rails staring at the ocean, trying to figure out who he was now that the war was over. Harrison joined him there on the third day out. You going back to school? Finish that engineering degree? Maybe, I do not know. What about you? Texas, Marianne, hardware store. Maybe get married, have kids. Pretend I was never anything more than a farm boy. You are more than that. So are you, do not forget it. The ship arrived in New York Harbor on June 15th. The Statue of Liberty rose from the water, green and massive and impossibly beautiful. Men cheered, wept, held each other. Sullivan felt nothing, just emptiness where relief should have been. The dock was chaos, families waiting, signs held high, women in their best dresses, children waving flags. Sullivan saw his parents in the crowd, his father in his fire captain's uniform, his mother clutching a handkerchief. They embraced. His mother cried. His father gripped his shoulders and said he was proud. Sullivan nodded and smiled and felt like a fraud. Harrison's reunion was different. Marianne had traveled from Texas. She ran to him, jumped into his arms, kissed him with the kind of passion that comes from months of fear finally ending. They held each other and cried and laughed, and Sullivan watched and felt happy for his friend and sad for himself in equal measure. Marianne turned to Sullivan, hugged him fiercely. "You brought him home. Thank you. Thank you so much. He brought himself home. I just flew the plane." "That is not what Tommy told me. He said you saved his life. He said you did the impossible." "We both did the impossible." She stepped back, looked at both men. "You are family now. You understand family. You ever need anything, you call. You ever want to visit Texas, you come. Our door is always open." Sullivan thanked her, meant it, but knew he would never take her up on the offer. Visits meant talking about the war, talking about the rescue, talking about things he wanted to forget. At the edge of the dock, Sullivan and Harrison said goodbye. They shook hands, then hugged, held on longer than either intended. "Take care of yourself, Sully. You too, farm boy. We will write. Stay in touch." "Yeah, we will." But Sullivan knew they would not, or if they did, it would be Christmas cards and brief notes and the slow fading of a friendship too intense to sustain in peacetime. They had been forged in fire. Without the fire, what were they? Sullivan went home to Philadelphia, returned to his old bedroom, tried to sleep, and could not. The nightmares came every night now. O'Brien, Harrison on the wing, German soldiers, the trees coming closer, the sound of bullets hitting metal. He woke screaming. His mother would come to check on him. He would lie and say he was fine. He enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, finished his engineering degree, but his heart was not in it. He could not focus on bridges and buildings when his mind kept returning to sky and speed and the split-second decisions that meant life or death. In 1947, he switched to accounting, joined his father's firm. Numbers were safe. Numbers did not require creativity or passion or emotional investment. Numbers were just numbers. He could hide in them. He married Elizabeth in 1948, a nurse who had worked at a veterans hospital. She understood trauma, understood nightmares, understood that some men came back from war broken and needed patience and time to heal, if they ever healed at all. Their first son was born in 1949. Sullivan named him Patrick, for O'Brien. Elizabeth understood, did not question, just held his hand when he cried after the christening. Sullivan tried to fly again in 1950, went to a small airport, rented a Cessna, sat in the cockpit with his hands on the controls and could not start the engine. The panic came like a wave. His hands shook. His breathing went ragged. He climbed out and walked away and never tried again. He was 28 years old and already done with the thing he had loved most. In Texas, Harrison married Marianne, took over his father's hardware store, tried to be normal. But normal was hard when you had seen the things he had seen, done the things he had done, survived things that should have killed you. The nightmares came for him too. Wind and cold and the sensation of falling. He would wake gripping the bed sheets so hard his knuckles turned white. Marianne would hold him, talk him down, remind him he was home. He was safe. The war was over. But the war was never really over for men who had seen combat. It just went quiet for a while, lurked in the back of the mind, waited for triggers, a plane overhead, a car backfiring, the smell of gasoline, small things that brought back large terrors. Sullivan and Harrison exchanged Christmas cards for 5 years, brief notes about ordinary things. Harrison married, Sullivan married, Harrison's first child, Sullivan's first child. The cards became less frequent, then stopped entirely. Not from anger or intention, just from the slow drift that happens when men move forward into different lives. In 1987, a researcher from the Air Force Historical Research Agency contacted Sullivan. They had discovered after-action reports from April 1, 1945. The German reports from Flak Battery 447, the engineering analyses. They wanted to interview him for the historical record. Sullivan, now 65 and retired, initially refused. then changed his mind when they told him they wanted to interview Harrison too. He had not spoken to Harrison in 32 years, had wondered occasionally if his wingman was even still alive. The thought of seeing him again brought a mix of hope and dread. They met at a CBS studio in February 1988, both men in their 60s now, hair gray, bodies softer, eyes older. They stared at each other for a moment. Then Harrison grinned that same farm boy grin from 43 years earlier. "You look old, Sully. You look worse, farm boy." They embraced, held on, felt 43 years collapse into nothing. They were young again. They were in England again. They were wingmen again. The interview aired in March. The interviewer asked the obvious questions. Why did you land? How did you survive? What was it like? Sullivan and Harrison answered honestly, gave the world a glimpse of what it meant to be wingmen, to fly together, to survive together, to carry each other through impossible things. Near the end, the interviewer asked Sullivan why he never flew again after the war. Sullivan paused, looked at Harrison, back at the camera. Because every time I sat in a cockpit, I saw two things. My first wingman dying, and my second wingman on my wing 1 second from death. I could not carry that weight and still fly. So I gave up flying. It was the price of surviving. The interviewer asked Harrison what he remembered most about those 17 minutes. Harrison's answer came without hesitation. How much I trusted him. I was terrified. I was freezing. I was sure I would die. But I never doubted that if anyone could save me, it was Sully. That trust, that absolute certainty that your wingman has your back, that is what got me through. That is what defines brotherhood. After the interview, they had dinner, talked for hours, caught up on decades, children and grandchildren, successes and failures, lives lived in the long shadow of one extraordinary day. Do you still have nightmares? Harrison asked. Sometimes, less than before. You. Yeah, sometimes I am back on that wing, but mostly now I remember what came after, landing safe, knowing we made it. That part is not so bad. I wish I could remember it that way. Maybe someday you will. They parted with promises to stay in touch this time, to not let decades pass again. They meant it, and this time they kept the promise, called each other monthly, visited once a year, rebuilt the friendship that had never really ended, just paused. Harrison died on January 25, 1998, heart failure at 76. His funeral in San Antonio drew 300 mourners. 47 were former pilots. Sullivan flew down, delivered the eulogy, spoke for 7 minutes about the clearing and the Germans and the 43 seconds on the ground. Spoke about 17 minutes that defined what brotherhood meant. Ended with words that came from the deepest part of his heart. Tommy trusted me to get him home. I did. That is the only thing that ever mattered. He broke down crying, could not finish. Marianne came to the podium, embraced him, whispered that Tommy had loved him like a brother, that the rescue had given Tommy 43 extra years of life, 43 years of marriage and children and grandchildren, and all the ordinary beautiful moments that make a life worth living. Sullivan returned to Philadelphia, back to his life, but something had shifted. Some weight had lifted. For the first time in 53 years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, saving Harrison had been enough. Maybe he had earned redemption after all. Robert Sullivan died on March 15, 2007, 85 years old, pneumonia. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His headstone was simple. Name, rank, dates, Distinguished Flying Cross. And one word that said everything. Wingman. Today, Sullivan's P-51D Mustang still flies. The aircraft, with serial number 4414888, survived the war. Was sold as surplus in 1946 for $1,500. Passed through various owners. Was restored in 1985 by a warbird enthusiast who knew the history, who painted it in Sullivan's original markings. Red and white checkerboard nose. The name City of Angels below the cockpit. The current owner flies it at air shows across America. And when people ask about the aircraft's history, he tells them about April 1st, 1945, about the clearing in France, about Harrison on the wing. About 43 seconds and 17 minutes, that proved that sometimes when everything says something is impossible, American courage and brotherhood can make it happen anyway. The story teaches this: a calculated risk is different from recklessness. Sullivan knew the odds. He understood the physics. He recognized that conventional wisdom said his plan would fail. He attempted it anyway because the alternative was leaving a man behind. That is not heroism born from ignorance. That is heroism born from full knowledge of cost and consequence and choosing action despite the cost. Every element of Sullivan's rescue violated regulations and exceeded aircraft limitations and ignored tactical doctrine. Every element was necessary. 2 men went into occupied France. 2 men came out. The mathematics of war usually do not work that way. On April 1st, 1945, they did. This is what the greatest generation understood. This is what they taught through action, not words. That freedom means responsibility. That liberty requires sacrifice. That we protect each other not because we are ordered to, but because that is what free people do. That is the American way. Not perfect, not without honor, but worth defending, worth preserving, worth passing to the next generation. Sullivan and Harrison are gone now. All the men who flew in that war are fading. Soon there will be no one left who remembers firsthand what it meant to be young and scared and far from home and fighting for something bigger than yourself. But their story remains. Their example remains. The P-51 still flies. And every time it takes to the sky, it carries with it the memory of 2 men who proved that brotherhood and duty and courage are not just words. They are choices, made in split seconds, with consequences that echo through generations. If you are watching this and you served in the military, you know what wingman means. You know what it means to have someone's back, to trust and be trusted, to be part of something larger than yourself. Share your story in the comments. Let us know where you served, who had your back, who you would have flown into hell for. And if this story moved you, hit that like button. Share it. Make sure the next generation knows that heroes are not perfect. They are human. They make mistakes. They carry guilt. They struggle with demons. But when it matters, when everything is on the line, they do the impossible anyway. Because that is what Americans do. That is what wingmen do. That is what brothers do. Sullivan and Harrison understood this. They lived it. And their story, their impossible, beautiful, terrible story, reminds us that the bonds we forge in crisis define who we are long after the crisis has passed. Never alone, never forgotten, always together. That is the code. That is the promise. That is what it means to be wingmen.